Now back to our democracy and media book, looking at Japan this time. And one of the major focuses is, why did it take TV so long to become a dominant medium? Why did newspaper hang around so long? We'll get to that. But before that, one of the reasons why I really like this chapter, well, one is because it focuses on a democracy that is not Western. It is an Eastern democracy. It's a younger democracy. It's an advanced economy, but still distinctly different. So it gives us more generalizations if we find similarities. But I like this chapter also because it starts off talking about what media in a democracy are supposed to do. And it gives us different dogs as a way of visualizing it. You have a watchdog, guard dog, guide dog, and lapdog. So in general, a watchdog, media acting as a watchdog, you can think of as the fourth estate, as a check on government corruption, checks and balances. A guard dog would be guarding the public from government corruption, not acting as a checks and balance, but protecting the people from government, perhaps from democratic backsliding, from authoritarianism. A guide dog is the idea that media guide the public by setting the agenda in the news to let them know what's important of the day, what is important in news that they should concentrate on. People do not have time, most people do not have the time to follow the news all day long. They rely on media to give them a summary of it. So that is the guide dog aspect. The lapdog aspect is simply that media in many cases do nothing more than transmit government messages to the people. They don't provide a commentary, they don't break things down. There's a government message, the government calls media, they turn on the cameras, they show exactly what the government says, and hand it straight to the people. So that's 4 different roles that media have in this chapter's perspective in a democracy. We'll talk about this more in the forum and see, is this really the case or not? In order to understand media and politics in Japan and why newspapers stuck around so long, you need to understand reporters' clubs and what they are. We'll talk about in a minute if they exist in other places. But the general idea with reporters' clubs is that in different areas in different cities, newspaper organizations got together to create these clubs to restrict access to information, that way only they would have it. They created a monopoly in the industry, and they created close-knit relationships with elected politicians and bureaucrats. And it evolved over time to where the only people who had that direct access are reporters' clubs. Those were the only journalists who did, and only in newspapers. If you were an independent newspaper or if you were an independent magazine, you didn't have the access. If you wanted to write on politics, you had to write on what the newspapers had already written. Right? That's a pretty big deal. Now, do we have anything similar to this in other democracies or in the US? Well, I'm sure many of you have heard of the White House press corps. And of course, there's a press corps that covers Congress, there's a press corps that covers the Supreme Court. When you see a White House briefing, generally speaking, you see these same reporters from the same news organizations every single time. That's not by accident. They may not call it a reporters club, but it is in fact very similar. If you're an independent news agency and you want to write about something that happened at a White House press briefing, what do you have to do? You have to write about whatever CBS or ABC or Fox, whatever those industries wrote on, you have to write on their interpretation because you were not invited. So yes, although they may not be called reporters clubs here or anywhere else, these type of industry norms do exist in other democracies. I just think it's really important that we point it out finally. And it takes us going all the way to Japan in order to do so. Now, for a long time, TV only complemented newspapers for many reasons. But one of the biggest reasons is because newspaper clubs had the exclusive access. And TV was big in Japan. A lot of people watched it. Their main channel was very comparable to the BBC in Great Britain. Just it wasn't at that point into targeting political news. It was more in entertainment and in other news. But there is at least 4 institutional level or aggregate level reasons why Japan as a country also supported newspaper industry for so long after much of the rest of the Western democratic world had abandoned it. And number 1 is education. Japan has for a very long time had one of the highest and best quality educations in the world. What do you need in order to be able to consume newspapers? The ability to read and interest in politics. What do we know so far from previous regression analysis we've done? Education is correlated with interest in politics. And newspapers, if they have a lot of political information in it, and you have a high level of education, it makes sense that you would read a newspaper. Furthermore, newspapers, they weren't structured in the same way, financially speaking, as most Western papers. Most Western papers survived off advertisement, and still do today. Newspapers in Japan survived off of subscriptions. And what's more, newspapers, they were so in demand, they printed a morning and an afternoon edition. That's how much news they had. That's how much exclusive links they had to elected and bureaucratic officials. All right, and then the nature of the Japanese workday. The fact that you would get your paper in the morning before you go to work, or you would get it on your way to work. Many people take the train and other forms of transportation that gives them an opportunity to read papers while commuting to work. Also, the afternoon paper would come out on your commute home. And by the time you got home and the evening news was on, the afternoon paper already told you everything that you needed to know. So newspapers structured their timeline in a way that kept them more important than TV would be. So, and because of all this, TV just kind of complemented newspapers. They didn't really try to compete with them because Reporters Club had that niche market, that access to politicians that no one else had. But we see that changes pretty quickly coming into the 1990s. Now, something we hadn't talked about yet, though, really is the political system of Japan. Japan was forced to democratize and forced to go to a capitalist economy after World War II ended in 1945. In the 1950s, a party arises called the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. This party was extremely successful at turning around Japan after World War II and making them a thriving economic democratic country. So the LDP was hugely liked by the population. They stayed in power from the 1950s all the way up to what we're about to talk about in the 1990s. So Reporters Club had direct access to the LDP political party. There were other political parties, but they weren't significant. They didn't win. Okay? So what ends up happening? Well, we see a small change. Well, you could say small, but when you change an electoral system in a country, usually it has major ramifications. In the early 1990s, there's an electoral law change in Japan and how districts are worked out and apportioned. I'm not going to go into the exacts, but you just need to realize they change electoral laws, therefore it gives an opening for new parties. What more that we see is that the LDP starts to fracture and split. And you get this younger group of LDP politicians who break away and start their own party. Right? So this is big. You have new electoral laws, which allows for the opportunity of election of a new party. Then the major party splits and they form their own party. Okay, this sounds like opportunity for change here. Then what's more, this new party, they realize something very important. The LDP and the newspapers, reporters clubs are linked. There's no way the new party, being former LDP members, there's no way they're going to be able to really send out their message to the public and get elected just by trying to use newspapers. Won't happen. So what do? they decide to try television. And what happens? They find out as younger members of the LDP, as new elites of a different party, and younger, I have to stress younger so much, when they go on television and people can finally see them, people actually like them. People like seeing their politicians for who they are. They like hearing and seeing the voice and the face together. And this new party becomes extremely popular, extremely quick, using television as their medium and staying completely away from newspaper reporters' clubs. So the new breakaway of the LDP start to get really popular in television. So the old LDP elites decide, maybe we should try this TV thing. Well, they weren't quite as popular. People saw how old these elites were. And they wanted young, they wanted fresh, they wanted change. So by the older LDP trying to capitalize on the new medium of TV, they ended up hurting themselves. Whereas the younger, the elites that broke off of the LDP, TV, it helped them. It also created, in comparison to newspaper reporters' clubs, a really interesting fact that newspapers became less important and TV became important. Because the LDP and the new breakaways both started focusing on television. And newspaper clubs started losing their power of exclusivity. All right, so that's a major change in the role of politics and media. But also, because the old LDP tried to capitalize on TV, but it ended up hurting them, they lost the 1993 and 94 elections in Japan. And for the first time ever, the LDP loses power in Japan and a new political party wins. Now, in democratization literature, we would call this democratic consolidation. When the first democratically elected party loses a subsequent election and peacefully gives up power to a different political party, then you know they are consolidated as a democracy and their likelihood of reverting to authoritarianism is next to zero. Now, that being said, it only did last 2 years. The LDP was entrenched in Japanese politics. They came back in 1994 afterwards, and then they stayed in power until 2009, though. 2009, 2012, we saw a shift. But then 2012, the LDP comes back. And the LDP is still in power today. Shinzo Abe is the leader of the party, leader of the country. Once again, though, the LDP is extremely powerful. They had, for the most part, been entrenched in Japanese political system, in government, since 1955, since the founding of their democracy. That means even in those two time spans, 93 to 94 and 09 to 12, where a different political party ruled, all of the bureaucracy of all Japan were still LDP appointed people. All the bureaucracy was still the LDP. There's no difference. So getting away from that is extremely difficult. But an important question for us to think about, as far as media and democracy goes, democratic consolidation is a really important thing. We really want to see new democracies consolidate. That way there's no chance of them going back to authoritarianism. And in this case, you could argue, and many people do, that the only reason the LDP lost and a different party was able to come to power, for the first time ever, you saw a change of political parties in Japan, was because the new party decided to use TV as their medium of choice. So here we're implying that television aided democratic consolidation in Japan. What do you think? Does a medium have that much power in democratic countries today? Hit the forums. I'll be interested to see what you say.